everybody. Welcome. Good evening. Thank you all for coming. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwartz. I run the LSAT blog. I also host the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. I've been teaching the LSAT for about 15 years now. I started off back in 2005. I got a cold diagnostic and a large dose of cold harsh reality when I scored a 152 on my first initial LSAT diagnostic. And my next diagnostic was also in the low 150s, and the one after that, and the one after that, and the one after that. But very gradually, over the course of what ended up being an entire year, I brought my score from the low 150s to a 175 on test day. And my goal for you, of course, is that your path to LSAT success is much quicker and less painful than mine was. And I hope that tonight I'll be able to share some of the lessons I learned along the way, both with my own personal LSAT journey, as well as the lessons I've learned from teaching many other students along the way over the course of my LSAT career. Now, I do want this class to be interactive, so I will speak for a bit, then open it up to a general Q&A on anything at all, LSAT and law school admissions, whether it's about LSAT self-study, digital LSAT prep, how to structure your LSAT study schedules, what resources to use, anything at all is fair game. Again, there is this chat function, and I do want this to be interactive because if you just want to watch, you might as well sign off now and watch the recording later. The real benefit of being able to attend class with me live now is to ask the questions that are on your mind. So please keep sending in your questions. I'm seeing them come up on the screen. First, I will run through the agenda for tonight. And then, like I said, I will open it up to that general Q&A on anything at all, LSAT and law school admissions. Now, one of the biggest mistakes I made was what I have now termed the obsessive practice exam narrative. The obsessive practice exam narrative. The idea that taking test after test after test will magically lead to some breakthrough or unlock some hidden pattern in the mistakes that you're making. And the LSAT really lends itself to this because the exams are numbered, they're sequential, they're chronological. So a lot of folks will just start with exam number 1 and work up from there. Or they'll get any old book of exams, start with those, and then once again, work up from there, older to newer. And they'll track obsessively with spreadsheets, measuring their results, being happy or sad about those results, and then moving on to the next one. So the first secret of the highly successful LSAT student is to avoid this obsessive practice exam narrative and instead study for the LSAT with a structured plan of attack so that step by step, day by day, you know exactly what to do and what not to do every single day over the course of your prep. Now, I started my website, the LSAT blog, back in 2008. And one of the first requests I got was for detailed study plans. So I created free week-by-week study plans, and they're available on the site still. Of course, I've updated them and made improvements along the way. But study plans were the biggest request I got, and I delivered. I now have study plans on a 1-month timeline all the way up to a 7-month timeline for whatever your time frame is for taking the LSAT. So you want to definitely use a detailed study plan. I have the free week-by-week ones. I also have the paid, even more detailed day-by-day study plans because it really helps to remove the ambiguity about what to do. Otherwise, you go based on simply how you feel that day or what you like or what you don't like. Certainly, that's what I did when I was studying. I would just do exam after exam, and I'd say, you know what? I don't really like games today. I don't really feel like doing that, so I'll do logical reasoning instead, or I'll do reading comp instead. And then you focus on what you like more and what's easier for you. But in reality, you should do what's tougher for you, of course. Focus on your weak areas to improve there. Now, whether you use my study plans or not, the framework underlying them is really important. And that's what I call the LASER approach to LSAT studying. LASER is an acronym standing for Learning, Accuracy, Sections, Exams, and Review. Again, LASER is Learning, Accuracy, Sections, Exams, and Review. Learning is theory, reading textbook chapters, watching course video lessons or videos on the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel, basically learning the basics of the exam and specifically what it involves. So what types of logic games are there? What types of reading comp passages are there? What's a strengthening question in logical reasoning? What's a necessary assumption question? And so on. So simply familiarizing yourself with the basics. You start there because, of course, you have to know the lay of the land before you dive in. When you're doing a full-length prep test, it's all mixed together. It's a grab bag. You never know what you're going to get next. So knowing the basics of each question type makes it easier, of course, to know the proper perspective from which to view it, to know the task at hand. Then secondly, A is for accuracy, which is doing individual questions by type. So doing several ordering logic games in a row, or several weekend questions in a row, or several reading comp science passages in a row, to understand the common patterns in each question type. Then S is for sections, doing individual timed 35-minute sections to work on your pacing. This is especially important in logical reasoning, where the questions are in a clear general order of difficulty. So you don't want to allot the same amount of time to every single question because there's a variety. The first 10 are easier, and you should complete them more quickly and build up a time bank to handle the tougher questions later in the section. Then E is for exams and endurance, doing full-length 5-section timed exam, because of course that is grueling. That's much tougher than doing a single individual section. Pulling it all together with a full-length 5-section timed exam takes you about 3 hours. That's a lot. Even personally, my brain is fried after doing all that, even still. And so you want to do at least ideally 10 full-length timed exams before test day. Then finally, R is for review, which is too often neglected as part of the study process. Like I said, students take exam after exam and just move on to the next one immediately, or they look at the answer key and say, oh, I get it now, and move on, when in reality, you should take fewer exams and review them in more depth. Which brings me to the second secret of highly successful LSAT students, what I call the Socratic review method. Excruciatingly detailed review to get down to the root of the problem, what gave you difficulty. So for every question you get wrong, or every question you have difficulty with, those where you're down to 2 and you guessed and got lucky, it could have just as easily gone the other way the next time around. So of course, you want to slow down and figure out exactly where your misunderstanding stemmed from, what gave you pause, what led you down the wrong path. So specifically, if let's say we're looking at the stimulus in logical reasoning, what confused you about the stimulus? What made it difficult? Maybe it was the method of reasoning. Maybe it was the structure. Like maybe they buried the conclusion in the middle of the stimulus when typically you're expecting it to be at the end or at the beginning. Or maybe they're using annoying words like unless, except, until, and without that are less obvious conditional indicators and require a little bit of translation. Or maybe you've got to link together multiple conditionals in the stimulus. Or maybe it's on a topic that you don't like science or philosophy, aestheticism, or really tightly worded formal logic stuff that you would never hear in everyday life. That often gives students a lot of trouble. So whatever your personal weak area is, you got to figure out where that conceptual gap is so you can avoid making the same mistake in the future. If your misunderstanding was from the question stem, maybe the question stem was worded in an unfamiliar way, even to refer to a common question type. Or maybe you're not totally confident in the difference between necessary assumption questions and sufficient assumption questions. So if that is the case, you've got to go back to basics on that. Then finally, if your error came from the answer choices, you've got to figure out what was tempting about the wrong answer choice that made you pick it or consider it, and what ultimately made it wrong, and what was discouraging about the right answer that pushed you away from it, and what ultimately made it correct. You've got to do this again and again and again, basically engaging in a detailed interrogation of your own thought process. That's why I call this the Socratic review method, because you're really engaging in a dialogue, maybe with yourself personally, internally, or maybe with a friend or a coach or a tutor or a study buddy. And if you have nobody to talk to about this, post online in the LSAT Unplugged Facebook group. That's what we have that for, a place to connect with like-minded students who are going through the same process as you. Write down your thought process, articulate it, keep it in a Google Doc or a Word doc, or some folks like to use a physical journal like a bullet journal, but write it out or talk it out. There's really something important about speaking it out to help you clarify your own thoughts. You learn a lot by teaching others as well. And I've certainly learned a lot over the course of my LSAT career teaching others, because it really forces you to clarify your thoughts and lay them out more specifically. Like I said, it's too easy to look at the correct answer and then say, I get it now, or to Google an explanation or watch a video, even mine, and then say, oh, that's the way to do it, I'm good. But you've got to really first analyze your thought process for yourself before looking outwards towards what others say about the problems, because you don't want to use those explanations as a crutch. Now, I talked about writing out your review process, and I have an example for you here I will put in the chat to show you what one student's example of this articulation looks like. And I'm not sharing it because it's the perfect or ideal way to do this. I'm sharing it, in fact, because it's imperfect, but it's a realistic way to do this that I think any one of you tonight could engage in a similar line of analysis or inquiry of your own thought process. Why did one choice tempt you? What ultimately makes it wrong? What made another choice seem unappealing? What ultimately makes it correct? If you're diagramming, how do you go about diagramming it? Personally, for the students I work with one-on-one, I require them to do this, to send me the 3 to 5 hardest LSAT problems they've recently encountered, along with photos of their diagrams and notes, so we can really look at what they're doing. But I'm also having them do this just for themselves, to have them practice what it's like to engage in this kind of analysis. Because if you don't have that accountability, you might not do it at all. So you might find a study buddy, and then you share with them your analysis, they share their analysis, and you trade thoughts and engage in that discussion about each one. Now, the third secret of highly successful LSAT students is simply being willing to retake and being willing to put in the time that's necessary. I don't think that anybody should apply to law school with only one LSAT score or attempt on record unless you scored above your practice test average. And here's why. It's because there is no downside to retaking the LSAT at least once. Law schools do not average multiple LSAT scores. They only take the highest score. So through luck alone, you could do maybe 3 to 4 points better. There's actually a margin of error or score band of 3.5 points on either end. So if your true aptitude is a 160, you might get a 160 on test day, but you might also get a 163 or a 164. And obviously the 163, 164 will open far more doors for you than a 160 would. So some folks get into better law schools and get more scholarship money and get higher LSAT scores simply because they were willing to give it another shot and they did better. And if not, again, no big deal, because law schools only take the highest score. They only have incentive to do so. And that's what they submit to the American Bar Association. That's what they submit for the US News rankings. And so that's ultimately what they care about. And you might have heard about the retake paradox, which is that the typical retaker improves only an average of 2.8 points. So maybe they got a 160 first, then they got a 163. And you might say only 2.8 points, only about 3 points, but that's actually a lot. That's a significant impact on your law school admission chances, a significant impact on your scholarship money. By one estimate, the value of a single point on the LSAT is $4,000. $4,000. So 3 points could be a value to you of $12,000. And so if you're thinking, do I really want to study for the LSAT for another month or two? Why not? That's the easiest money you'll ever make. You prorate that, it's equivalent of like getting a 6-figure income just for studying for the LSAT. And maybe you don't even have to study that much. If you've already taken it, you've already built the foundation, all you really have to do is stay fresh on the LSAT until the next opportunity to retake it. And the LSAT's offered nearly every single month now. It's offered 9-10 times a year. So if you're aiming for March, you could take it again in April. Or if you're taking it in June, you could take it again in July. And you've only got to do it maybe a timed exam or two a week for another 4 to 5 weeks. And that's it. And then if you study more on top of that and work on your weak areas or change your approach from whatever was missing the first time around, you could do even better than that. So I really see no reason at all not to retake. Now, obviously taking it 5-6 times starts to look a little bit questionable, but 2 to 3, even 4 times is no big deal at all. And of course, if you are looking to retake, you want to think about what you are going to do differently the next time around. Number 4, highly successful LSAT students properly simulate test day conditions. No giving yourself extra time, no pausing the clock, no taking only 4 sections when you're going to do 5 on test day. This leads to what I call the score inflation problem, that students take exams under easier conditions. Maybe you're practicing or studying in the quiet of your own home. Maybe you're giving yourself frequent bathroom breaks and pausing the clock, or maybe you're checking your email or your phone in between, or going up to the refrigerator. You can't do any of that on test day, of course, and so you should practice like it's game day. And top scorers get really specific about this. Maybe some folks go overboard, but hey, if it helps you, why not? So a couple of things you could do are, number one, this is the most obvious perhaps, take your practice tests at the same time of day you will take the actual thing. So if you're taking it at 9 a.m., take your practice tests at 9 a.m. and get used to waking up at the same time you'll be waking up on test day. And there is a phenomenon known as sleep inertia, meaning that it takes your brain a couple of hours to wake up in the morning. So if you're taking your practice test or the actual thing at 9 a.m., don't wake up at 8 a.m. Instead, wake up ideally at least at 6 a.m., 3 hours prior. And if you're in college, of course, you might be on a pretty late schedule and 6 a.m. might seem really, really early to you. And so if that's the case, then you've got to gradually move your schedule earlier and earlier over the weeks leading up to your test date. So maybe every day you move it up 10 minutes, 15 minutes, so that by test day the week prior, you're waking up at 6 a.m. like it's the easiest thing in the world. And then, of course, if your test is in the afternoon at 1 p.m., then take all your practice tests at 1 p.m. And also figure out your situation when it comes to breakfast, coffee, tea, snacks, your bathroom schedule if you have one. You want to mimic everything as closely as possible. And so that involves thinking of all the little details. Whatever snack you're eating on test day, a banana, a granola bar, trail mix, eat that during your practice tests as well. If you have a favorite outfit that makes you feel good, a favorite lucky t-shirt or sweatshirt, wear that at the same time. And if you feel more comfortable in sweatpants over jeans or slacks, then wear sweatpants during your practice tests and wear them on test day too. Who cares? It's for you. You're focusing on yourself here and whatever it takes you to succeed. And then, of course, realistic timing. On top of that, for the digital LSAT specifically, part of simulating test day conditions means that you're taking at least a couple of practice tests on a tablet. And if you don't have a tablet, get a tablet or borrow one. Which brings me to number 5 here. The fifth secret of highly successful LSAT students is properly simulate the digital LSAT as well. Make the investment in the prep materials that you feel you need, including getting a tablet. LSAC is using a Microsoft Surface Go specifically for the digital LSAT, but you could practice on any old tablet you want, a Samsung, an iPad, or an Amazon Fire even. That's relatively more affordable, of course. And if there's a material or resource you think would be beneficial to you, then get it. Like I said, the value of a single point is $4,000. So to not buy another book of 10 exams for $20 seems pretty foolish in comparison. Be willing to make the investment and believe in yourself that it's going to pay off. It's really a drop in the bucket compared to the value of getting into a better law school or getting more scholarship money. So if you think that there's a book or a course or a tutor that could help you, then seek that out, especially if you're retaking it and you denied yourself the benefit of that resource the first time, then you definitely want to look for that the next time around. Now, when it comes to simulating the digital LSAT, there are a couple of exams on LSAC's website at familiar.lsac.org. They have 3 exams in the digital format, exams 71, 73, and 74. And of course, they will be releasing more, presumably, in the coming months. But this site does not work well on a smartphone, and it doesn't work that well on a desktop either, because you want the touchscreen interactivity that you're going to have on test day. Now, I don't want to stress this point too much because, of course, the content of the exam has not changed at all. Only the style in which it is delivered is changed, but you want to walk in at least having done a couple of run-throughs in the same way you'll be doing the actual thing. So get a tablet or borrow one at the very least in the lead up to the test day. Now, number 6, Steve's practice test rule is maximum 2 timed exams per week, minimum 2 hours reviewing each test. This is meant to help you avoid burning out. Too many students, again, back to that obsessive practice exam narrative, they're doing every single exam ever released and maybe trying to do all of them in the span of a few months, doing one a day. I've even heard of folks doing 2 a day. This is a recipe for burnout. I would rather that you slow down and do more exams in depth and review them in depth rather than doing more exams, but only engaging in a cursory review of them and not really dialing down into specifically what gave you trouble. And aside from reviewing the content of the problems, you also want to be thinking about the pacing and the endurance factors. If it takes you a little while to get warmed up and you're always doing worse on the first section, then maybe you want to do a few warm-up questions before you start the actual exam. Or on the other hand, if you're petering out towards the end in the 5th section, then maybe you want to really work on that endurance and maybe even do the occasional 6-section exam in order to better build up your endurance. Again, maximum 2 exams per week, minimum 2 hours reviewing each test. Top scorers realize that quality is more important than quantity, of course, and doing fewer exams and reviewing them more is the recipe for really learning from your mistakes. Now, finally, number 7, top scorers really develop an appreciation for this exam. They learn to love the exam and respect the people who make it. I know it's easy to hate on a faceless bureaucracy like LSAC, especially when there have been a number of digital LSAT tech issues, and of course there are a number of fees associated with the entire process, and they're not always the best at communicating with students, but the people who create the exam content are brilliant. They really know what they're doing. They put a lot of effort into writing these questions, and their bar for quality is actually quite high. And so I would recommend that you learn everything you can about the way the test is constructed, what goes into creating it, and specifically, what are those little tricks and traps involved in the exam. Like I said, those traps of encouragement towards wrong answers, traps of discouragement away from right answers. They really put a tremendous amount of effort and thought into creating this, and their bar for what actually makes it onto the exam is quite high. Over the course of my career, I've managed to befriend a former writer of actual LSAT questions. I got to know him pretty well. We had a few discussions on the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. If you just search former LSAT question writer on my channel, you'll find those discussions. They're about 25 minutes each and pretty fascinating. I've also conducted a number of email interviews with him as well in written form, available on the LSAT blog website. And so I highly recommend seeking those out if you really want to understand the minds of the test takers and how they create this. Additionally, top scorers really adopt the mindset of this exam and become critical and skeptical of arguments rather than taking things at face value. And that kind of filters into every conversations in everyday life. If you ever found yourself overanalyzing statements other people make and pointing out flaws in their logic, and then of course ducking when they swing at you because they're pissed off that you're overanalyzing their language. I've certainly run into that problem a number of times, and I've had to dial it back and really segment the LSAT portion of my life and conversation and analysis from interactions with friends and family and such. And so, but that mindset and adopting it and almost in a way that you can't even really control it, that's a sign that you're doing something right and that you're really getting into the mindset of that analysis the LSAT requires. Aside from becoming curious about the exam and adopting the mindset, you might also want to start thinking about reverse engineering the exam as part of that review process. So really analyzing how they construct these problems to the point that you might actually write your own LSAT style questions, or at the very least, write your own explanations for official LSAT problems to take your LSAT review process to the next level. Not only laying out your own personal thought process, but going beyond that to really think, how could I explain this to somebody else? I learned a lot when I wrote my own LSAT explanations, and I've also written my own LSAT logic games from scratch. And I learned a lot in the process. And I learned that also that it was not easy, at least for me. It took me a full day, maybe at least 4 to 5 hours of really concentrated effort to write an original logic game from scratch that was flawless, containing no mistakes at all. And those are available on the LSAT blog website, by the way. I've written about 7 or 8 of them on my own. And It was a lot of fun. And I'd highly recommend writing at least a mini drill or two to see the logic that goes into these. So those are the 7. I've got a couple of bonus ones here to share with you that are somewhat tangential, but I thought they were worth mentioning. One of them is negotiation. So after you get your LSAT score, after you've applied, you might get offers and acceptances from law schools. But top scorers, those who really seek to understand this process, they negotiate with law schools to get more scholarship money. I had a great discussion the other week with the Dean of Admissions and Financial Aid at Baylor Law School. And we were talking about what good negotiation looks like and what bad negotiation looks like. And basically the takeaway is that you don't simply want to ask law schools for more money and say, because I need it, because I want it. Rather, say, my cost of living is going to be XYZ, and school A offered me this amount. Can you match or exceed that given what I expect to, the expenses I expect to incur moving to this area or taking on these obligations for law school? Do the calculations, provide them with a well-reasoned argument. And obviously, if you apply to multiple law schools, you'll have multiple offers that you can play them off each other. And don't try to be sneaky about it, and don't be a jerk about it either. Really, they're nice people. They want to help you, and they ultimately want you at their school, especially if you make a good personal connection with them. That can really have a big impact. And of course, the biggest factor in admissions, especially when it comes to getting more scholarship money, is getting that higher score. So you can make all the excuses about how you're not a good test taker or that things didn't go well on test day, but ultimately they're going to tell you simply retake and get that higher score. The last thing I'll say related is when it comes to law school selection, I noticed that both law school admission officers and applicants suffer from what I call runt syndrome, rankings under numerical threshold. Basically, everybody gets too wrapped up in a school's numerical ranking in the US News and World Report, when in reality, the ranking isn't the only number that matters. And if you look at how they actually construct the rankings, there's a lot of unimportant things that go into them, like the number of books they have in the library when everything is digital now, or how other law school professors think of that school, which becomes a kind of what's the word? Like basically, the system feeds itself a circular reasoning where they say, this school has a good reputation because of US News rankings from previous years, so I will rank it high once again because that has impacted my perception of that school. But why should you care what some random professor thinks about some random school they don't even have any exposure to? You're much better off thinking about what scholarship money are they offering? Are they in an area where I might ultimately want to practice law? Those are really the biggest things that should impact your decision. And then, of course, do you want to live in an urban, suburban, rural area? What makes sense for your family, if you have a family or significant others? Those are the factors you want to be thinking about. Don't think solely about the rankings, but how the rankings can help you is that if a school is ranked relatively low, but you wouldn't mind going there, and your LSAT score is above their median, then you could get significant scholarship money or even a full ride to go there, making it well worth it. So anyway, that's on my agenda for tonight. That pretty much sums it up. You've all asked a ton of great questions here, and I want to get to as many of them as possible. So I'm going to take a moment here to just take a look through them and see what jumps out at me. And of course, feel free to continue asking more. So let's see, related to the application process, how can you get an application fee waiver, especially if you want to apply to multiple schools? Well, the simplest way is simply to ask. Law schools often simply hand out application fee waivers because they want more applicants and because you won't get if you don't ask. They simply need you to ask to demonstrate interest, and then a lot of them will give them out, and that saves you maybe $100 right there. So email them asking for those fee waivers, and they'll often hand them out. Secondly, LSAC runs a number of law school forums where tons of law schools, dozens of them, are tabling, and you go up to them and say, could I have a fee waiver? I'm very interested in your school. A lot of times that's a good place to ask for them, and they will, once again, hand them out. And then some schools, typically lower ranked ones, will often just contact you offering the fee waiver because they want to drive up the number of applications. So that's another way to get it. So yeah, definitely seek those out. I think not enough folks know they can ask for them, but admissions officers, I mean, in a way, they're marketing their schools, they're promoting their schools, and they need you more than you need them, actually. So, because they have all their overhead to maintain. So I would definitely suggest keeping that in mind. Someone asked, is it true that the logic game section is being taken off of the LSAT? If so, when will that happen? So there's a lot of misinformation out there about this, and there were some recent news articles confirming the misunderstanding, the rumors about this. In reality, the logic game section is not going anywhere anytime soon, if at all. It might be removed for certain specific test takers who need accommodations for visual impairments, but it's not going away for the majority of students anytime soon, if ever. I taught a class where I covered this recently. If you just search on my YouTube channel, LSAT Unplugged, if you search, will LSAT logic games be removed? I go in depth analyzing the press releases and statements from LSAC and the attorneys involved in the lawsuit around this. And I basically share my thoughts that it's not going away. So you can go there for more on that. Someone asked, how many days a week should you spend doing LSAT prep when you are 4 months out from the exam? It will vary from person to person. I typically recommend 10 to 15 hours per week, but how you lay that out is ultimately really up to you. I don't have a strong opinion on that. It depends on whether you're working, if you're in school, what your other obligations are like. I wouldn't recommend doing more than 5 hours a day typically. Typically 4 or 5 is the most I would recommend. As for number of days, maybe 4 or 5 days. Take at least a couple of days off so that you don't burn out. And of course, my study plans go into more depth on this. Someone's asking, what's the best way to section out each category of prep to get the most out of it? Well, the study plans, once again, go into depth on that. In my study plans, I recommend starting with games, then reasoning, then reading comp. The reason is that games are typically the most intimidating at first, but they are the most learnable. And then, of course, logical reasoning is half the exam. Then finally, reading comp. So I say start with games, build your foundation there, then add in logical reasoning while still staying fresh on games, and finally move on to reading comp. But if you want to rearrange things, that's totally up to you. The schedules are more important for their level of specificity they contain about what to do than the particular day-by-day breakdown. And so if you want to do it compressed, that's totally fine. So some folks who are really gung-ho and have more time to study, well, they'll get the 5-month plan, even if they only have 3 months, and they'll work through it at a faster pace. And I'm fine with that as long as you don't go overboard and burn out. Now, if you're taking the exam for the first time, then get one of the regular day-by-day study plans so that you can focus on simply building your foundation first. My plans typically start with exams in the 60s and move up to the ones in the 70s and 80s as test day approaches. If your timeline is on a 3 to 5 month timeline or shorter than that, I would say you're probably best off simply going over the most 30 to 40 exams. You don't need to do more than that, so don't get the first 10 or the first 20. The relatively more recent exams are more relevant. So I would not start with the oldest. I would start with some of the ones from the past 10 years specifically and move to the more recent from there. Alternatively, if you have 6, 7, 8 months or more, then you could theoretically do every exam ever released, but I certainly don't think that you need to. I would say do fewer exams and again, review them in more depth. Can you go from a 140 to a 160? Yes, you certainly could. I don't see why not. It's certainly outside the norm, but if your cold diagnostic is a 140, then you have plenty of room for significant improvement, especially if you give yourself the time to improve significantly. On my site, the LSAT blog, I have a number of LSAT diaries from former students who wrote in about their study journeys, and I've categorized these by starting score and ultimate ending score. So you can see folks who went from a 141 to a 168 or a 145 to a 165 and everything in between. And personally, again, I went from a 152 to a 175. And so significant score increases are possible. They take a lot of work, and they start with building the foundation first. And my study plans help you build that foundation. As for when to start studying, if you are an undergrad in college, when to take it if you're an undergrad in college, it really depends on when you have the time. LSAT scores are valid for 5 years. So you have plenty of time to take it and then finish college, maybe even work for a year or two. And then if you still think that law school is right for you, then you apply. So you study whenever you have the time. For a lot of folks in college, they'll study over summer break. If they have a good amount of time, like 2 to 3 months, they could really focus on that. So I'd say Don't get a really time-intensive internship. Instead, dial down your responsibilities so that you can focus primarily or exclusively on the LSAT. Some folks will study over winter break. Some folks will, after they graduate, if they're lucky enough to have friends or family supporting them, really, I mean like parents or significant others supporting them, then they could do nothing but study at all. And that's obviously not the case for everybody. But if you're fortunate enough to be in that position, I would certainly take advantage of that opportunity to do nothing but study for the LSAT for at least a couple of months. Some folks who are working will take off a week from work or a month from work to focus on studying, or they will dial down their responsibilities, get time off from their boss, or load projects onto others for a little bit so they can focus on the LSAT studying. But really take it whenever you're ready, study for it whenever you're ready. And of course, having more time to study rather than less is typically beneficial, up to a point at least. As for best LSAT prep materials and programs, I happen to think mine, of course, are pretty fantastic. I linked them in the chat. I have the LSAT blog along with the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. I have guides, cheat sheets, checklists, explanations, and of course, the full video courses for every section of the exam. Dean is asking about necessary assumption questions. So necessary assumption questions are a very specific kind of logical reasoning question, and I think of them as actually being a very specific kind of must be true question, because they are not asking for new information. They are asking for something that is already implicit in the argument itself, something that the argument is logically committed to already. Now, all else being equal, I would gravitate towards relatively more moderate language for a necessary assumption question, because it's more likely to be supported by the stimulus and required by the stimulus than a more extreme answer choice would be. So that's mostly what I'll say on that. Of course, the negation technique is useful for necessary assumption questions. The correct answer choice when negated will destroy the argument, because the argument required all necessary assumptions to be implicit and to be true. Olivia is asking about logic games, how to perfect diagramming. Well, practice, of course. Practice, use all the resources available to you, and then look at video explanations for each game afterwards to confirm if you set it up correctly. Knowing that, of course, there is not only one way to set up any given logic game. There are multiple correct methods. The correct method is the one that works for you and gets you the correct answers in the time allotted. So look at different people's styles and see ultimately which style meshes best with your way of thinking. I've created free logic games explanations on LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel for the vast majority of logic games, and so you can see how I diagram them and compare them to your method. And typically, I like to do a lot of work up front to make multiple inferences up front, even multiple main diagrams. But that's my style. If that doesn't work for you, then try a different approach. Let's see, tons of more questions here. How to best study if you're taking the April LSAT, which at the moment is about 2 months away. If you're already decent on games, but logical reasoning is lacking, well, I would focus on logical reasoning then, of course. I would see if there's a particular question type in logical reasoning giving you trouble, like by question type as in strengthen questions, weaken, flaw, and then drill those by type on the side. I have categorizations of questions on my site, and so you could do a bunch of several flaw questions in a row, then several strengthen questions in a row, and of course on the side maybe do some individual timed LR sections while still doing a timed exam or two per week to focus on endurance. And the individual sections will also help you work on your pacing as well. I would not neglect games entirely, of course, because you do want to stay fresh on them. And if you're not getting better as time goes on, then you may want to postpone or withdraw to a later test date if you need more time. And nobody ever wants to postpone or withdraw. But really, if you're not close to your desired result as test day approaches, you're better off delaying and taking it at a later date so that you can apply with the best possible score. Since there's no reason to have a relatively lower score on your record if you can avoid it, I wouldn't take it if your practice tests were not close to where you ultimately wanted to be. And you're saying the review process is your struggle, then definitely engage in this Socratic review method that I outlined earlier in this class, because I really go through exactly what you should be doing in your post-game analysis of the problems that gave you trouble. Someone's asking about my one-on-one LSAT coaching. Yeah, so I work with a limited number of students one-on-one. It's a pretty intensive process. I require a lot of my students. And so if you'd like to discuss that with me, then of course, just shoot me an email after this class and we can set up another conversation to go more in depth on that. Someone's asking about internships. Do internships help your application? If you don't have those internships, will it hurt your application? You do not need internships of any sort. Law schools don't really care that much about it. It's maybe a nice to have depending on the nature of the internship. If you got to have really detailed, like hands-on experience, especially in the field of law, that's a nice to have. But law school admissions is primarily numbers driven. It's LSAT score, then GPA, then everything else. So I would not do an internship at the expense of your LSAT studying. If you have X number of hours per week, I would rather you devote those hours to LSAT prep than to getting some internship that pays you little or nothing at all. You're better off devoting that time to the LSAT. Like I said, a single point could be worth $4,000, getting you more scholarship money, getting you into a better law school, or both. And so in your free time, I would simply study for the LSAT. If you already have an internship that is relevant to the field of law specifically, then of course I would put that on your resume, maybe write about it in your personal statement, but you could really write about anything in your personal statement and you don't need to have that on your resume. And so if you don't have it, don't worry about it. Don't seek it out just for the purposes of admissions. But if you're not sure whether law school is right for you, and if you've never had any real world exposure to the practice of law, then I would recommend at least shadowing an attorney for a couple of days to see what is it really like to be an attorney. Because of course it is different than media portrayals on TV and in the movies. And so law schools do like to see it if you have it. But again, I wouldn't do it just to impress them or anything like that. Someone's asking regarding the rankings, won't the school you graduate from impact your chances of gaining employment? Shouldn't you be aiming for top 14 law schools? The answer is maybe, depending on what you would like to do. If you want to do big law or corporate law specifically and nothing else at all, then I would talk to attorneys at those firms, talk to the HR departments at those firms and see, do they hire exclusively or only from those big name schools? Again, think about region having an impact as well. I would also think to yourself, if you don't want to do big law or you're not sure if you want to, how would having all that law school debt impact your opportunities afterwards? If you graduate with tons of debt, your immediate obligation and incentive is going to be to pay that off by whatever means are necessary. And so if you want to practice environmental law or do something that's more public interest related, having that debt may influence your decision-making opportunities. And if you're not going to be in a major city, if you're going to be more local somewhere else outside of major cities, then maybe going somewhere to a regional law school that's lower ranked, but has a relatively better reputation in that area is going to be more important for you. So for example, I'm based in New York. Fordham Law School is not a top 14 law school. It's somewhere in the 30s, I believe, the 30s. But Fordham Law has a fairly good reputation in New York City relative to a higher ranked school in California like UCLA or USC, because there are many more Fordham Law grads in New York City than there are UCLA or USC grads in New York. And so Fordham Law would be a relatively better choice on average than USC would be, even though USC is ranked relatively higher. So that is something to consider as well. Got a couple folks asking how much time to devote to each section of the exam. Well, games is a quarter, logical reasoning is half, and reading comp is another quarter because there are two sections of logical reasoning. As for how much time to devote, that really depends on your personal weak areas. And so if reading comp is pretty good for you, then you may want to focus less on that. And if you suffer from trouble with a particular section like grouping games specifically, then I would simply drill grouping games. So there is no one size fits all approach to this. It really is personal. My study plans are simply a general framework related to how to go about this rather than what you must follow to the letter. And so I do find, though, that games is typically the most improvable section. So I would start there and then see how it goes. And if you're struggling and need to focus more time on it, then do that. You know, that's why it's also nice to have a long timeline where There's no urgency to when you're taking it. And so if you're watching this in March right now, of course, then you could take it in March, April, June, July, and still apply at the very beginning of the cycle in the fall. And even taking it in September or October would be perfectly fine as well. Even taking it in December would be okay to still apply in that cycle. But I would not, of course, take the LSAT in March and apply at the end of that cycle because it's a little bit tougher to get in and there's not as much scholarship money available. And so give yourself the time that you need to prep for this. And of course, having relatively more time is better if you can. I typically recommend 5 to 6 months in order to reach your fullest potential on the exam. And so if you're watching this in March, you're taking it in September, that's a really good amount of time. And then you can allocate time as you need it. And having more than enough time is obviously really beneficial for you so that you can devote more time to your weak areas as you discover them. So as a follow-up to that, Shinkuria was asking about focusing on areas you're stronger in. I would not focus where you're stronger. I would focus where you're relatively weaker. Alternatively, if you're not making any gains or headway despite trying multiple approaches over a long period of time for a given question type or section, then you might decide to cut your losses and focus on your strengths, but that is going to limit you with a certain ceiling on how high you can score. Because the typical 170 scorer gets perfect on games and then -3 on each of the other sections of the exam. So -3 on reasoning, -3 on the second reasoning, and -3 on reading comp, which gets you around a 170 with about 9-10 questions wrong. So top scorers tend to do perfect on games, maybe -1. As to where to focus, I would say if you want to get 170 plus, you should probably aim to perfect games, especially since they are more mathematical and unambiguous, given the symbolic logic involved. There's not the same ambiguities of language that you'll see in reading comp and logical reasoning. That's been my experience. That's what the typical scorer is like. Of course, there are exceptions to that. And so try it out, see what happens for you. But I would not neglect the weak areas without giving them a tremendous amount of effort, because that's where you typically get the biggest gains is from your weak areas. And so part of what I do in coaching is I help you see your blind spots and try out different approaches until we find one that sticks for you, because it's worth trying multiple approaches given the fact that every point counts on this exam, of course. The writing sample, someone asked about that. So the writing sample actually matters a little bit more than it used to because it's typed now. It's digital now for everybody. And so you do it online. They watch you with a webcam and a microphone for security purposes. And because it's typed, it's legible. So law schools are more likely to look at it than they previously would have been. So certainly don't treat it like a joke. Writing the perfect writing sample probably won't do a ton for your admissions chances, but writing a terrible one would definitely hurt you. So I wouldn't aim to perfect it, but I wouldn't neglect it altogether. It's most important for you if your grades in English were not that great, and if you're a non-native English speaker. Either of those factors makes them take an extra look at the writing sample because they want to know you can write well and that you're fluent in English. Otherwise, in general, I would say simply take it seriously, give it your best effort, but don't overly stress about it. Basically, you're given a scenario where you have two different options that are equally weighted, and you have to make a well-reasoned, reasonable argument in favor of one of them, while at the same time acknowledging the weaknesses of your side and the strengths of the other side. You have 35 minutes. There is a spell check function in the writing sample software that LSAC uses, and so you have plenty of time. I suspect that since it's typed now, you could probably type it out faster than you would have been able to previously write it by hand. So you maybe will have time to double check, triple check, add things to it, make edits if necessary. Take it seriously. But again, it's 35 minutes. You're not doing it at the test center anymore. You're doing it later on your own time. You have up to 1 year to complete it after your official LSAT test date administration. But I would do it sooner rather than later so that law schools see it. You don't want to forget about it and then they don't evaluate your application or they're asking you for it, which doesn't look great. So definitely get it done. But again, don't worry too much about it. So I know you've all asked a ton of great questions here tonight. I think I've tackled the majority of them. And so if nothing else pressing, I'm going to leave off here for now. But I want to thank you all for coming and asking such great questions. And of course, please feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. Again, I have the LSAT study plans. I have guides, cheat sheets, checklists, explanations, full video courses for every section, along with the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast, the Facebook group, the Instagram. And you can always reach me by email as well. So again, thank you all for coming. Have a good night, and we'll be in touch. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.